Pepsid Complete knows that food is one of the best parts of game day. That is, until heartburn strikes. Thankfully, just one chewable tablet of Pepsid Complete provides dual-action heartburn relief with an antacid that starts working instantly and an acid reducer that lasts all day. So you can stay focused on that second helping of chili without worrying about heartburn. All day based on 8-hour symptom relief studies during the day. Use product only as directed.
This episode is brought to you by Abercrombie. There's nothing better than the perfect jean and going out top combo, or an outfit that perfectly matches your plans. Abercrombie's relaxed jean goes with every occasion. Date nights with something lace, or daytime with a cozy sweater. And their barrel jean will surprise you. It's the trend that will become a staple in your wardrobe. Abercrombie denim comes in tons of rises, fits, and washes. Find your perfect pair online or in store.
Anselm combined in himself a gentleness of manner that won him the love of all who met him, with a determination of will that astonished all who opposed him. So writes Edmer of Canterbury. Welcome to Fortune's Wheel Podcast, a podcast that explores the infinitely fascinating and oft-overlooked high and late Middle Ages. I'm Jonathan, your host, and what you can expect to hear on this show is a story of our collective Western history. This isn't a polished story with neatly placed heroes and villains, but rather a complicated story, here specifically of three young men cast haphazardly upon the peaks of European power. A massive vacuum was left when their father, William the Conqueror, passed away, and his three boys were left picking up the pieces. This miniseries, that I'm calling A Tale of Three Brothers, is a story of sibling rivalry, betrayal, power, ambition, broken alliances, massive political restructuring, and each man's quest for legitimacy and legacy on a channel-spanning scale that includes kingdoms, duchies, and even the Holy Land itself. This is the 7th part of this miniseries, and England had a sick king who began questioning his treatment of the church. Brushes with death understandably have a strange effect on people, but only some adhere to the lessons learned. Before we begin, please consider joining us on Patreon, where you can enjoy more than 20 hours of bonus content as of this recording for as low as just $1 per month. We have full series covering stories such as Poland's rise throughout the 11th century, and our current ongoing series covering the legendary Alexius Komnenos. Join our growing community and help this show bring our shared story to life. This is episode 152, entitled Rufus's New Archbishop. Thank you for your support, thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy the show. Anselm. It's not a name that easily gets pushed into the background of history. Born in 1033 in the town of Aosta, this young man of Lombard descent decided the life of a nobleman was not what he wanted. His parents were a couple of local importance within the minor nobility of the Lombard kingdom of Burgundy. His father, Gundulf, was described by Edmer of Canterbury, a contemporary of Anselm's who would go on to write Anselm's biography. He was described as stern, ambitious, and worldly. He was a strict lord, but fair, but Anselm never jived with Gundulf's personality. Anselm was far more contemplative and fit for the life of study and daily devotion to God. It's no stretch to regard their relationship as anything less than strained throughout Anselm's childhood. Anselm most likely inherited some of these traits from his mother, Ermenberga, who was known for her gentle piety and profoundly deep faith. And regardless of his personality or spiritual development under the tutelage of his mother, it seemed Anselm's life was predetermined to take over the family business as lord of the manor and surrounding lands. However, during Anselm's early adolescence, Ermenberga died quite suddenly, and this left a gaping chasm between him and his father. Ermenberga had always been the mediator, but she was gone, and the two guys just couldn't seem to connect. At the age of 23, Anselm decided to leave the comfort of his noble manor. In fact, Anselm chose to leave the kingdom of Burgundy altogether, and where he ended up would change Christian theology and philosophy forever, as well as the relationship between the English monarchy and its church. As with us all, young Anselm's path didn't directly lead to his final destination. Anselm traveled throughout France, and very little's known of these travels, like very little. But we know it took him somewhere around 3 years to make it to the abbey that would change his life in the direction of the church forever. In 1059, he approached the doors of Bec Abbey in Normandy and was accepted into its monastic fold. Now, Bec Abbey was a Benedictine abbey. Not many of us today know what exactly Benedictine means, so indulge me while I explain how it's different from other ways of running a monastery. Saint Benedict of Nursia wrote what came to be called the Rule of Saint Benedict in the early 6th century. This was nothing short of revolution within Christianity, and that word revolution simply cannot be understated here. You can think of it like this. Before Saint Benedict, monasteries were diverse and scattered, and they were unregulated. After Saint Benedict, monasteries were organized, standardized, and most certainly connected. Let's take a look at the before for a moment. Now, during the 3rd and 4th centuries, Christianity drifted away from small pockets of followers, usually in hiding, scattered across the Roman Empire. Even within Rome itself, as we know from the stories of the Apostle St. Peter being crucified upside down and St. Paul being beheaded there. So, Christianity again, though spreading to new cities and establishing churches steadily across the Mediterranean, it was largely persecuted, making it extremely dangerous to practice and worship, at least out in public. Roman emperors such as Nero, Caligula, and Diocletian made it a sport to punish and murder Christians everywhere they were found. That is, until the year 312. See, a man named Constantine was the son of a Roman general named Constantius Chlorus. General Constantius rose to the rank of Caesar and then Augustus in the Western Empire. This was, of course, after the recent split of the empire into two by Diocletian. Constantius died in the year 306, leaving 34-year-old Constantine to be declared emperor by his father's army. For 6 years, Constantine fought against the other claimants until the last one remained. Constantine met Maxentius at the famous Milvian Bridge in 312, and it was this battle that would be one of those moments in history where we could, in the most effective way, call it a fork in the road. Just before the Battle of Milvian Bridge, Constantine had a vision. In the sky, a Chi-Rho, which is a combination of the Greek letters chi and rho, which are the first letters in the word Christ, along with the Latin phrase in hoc signo vincis, being heard in his mind, changed Constantine's strategy against Maxentius. In hoc signo vincis translates to, in this sign you will conquer. Constantine went with his gut on this one, had his soldiers paint a crucifixion cross on their shields, and they marched into battle as an army of Christ. Constantine emerged victorious. Maxentius was defeated. He was the sole ruler of the soon-to-be rejoined empire, and he was a changed man. Now, 1 year later, in 313, he issued the Edict of Milan, granting religious tolerance across the Roman Empire. Now, to dispel one key misconception people still propagate about Constantine the Great, Constantine did not make Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. He did adopt its core tenets personally after 312, and he did finally get baptized just before his death in 337, but he never officially dispensed of Roman religion. What Constantine did was declare religious tolerance for all. The exact words from the Edict of Milan in 313 are, quote, "We grant both to Christians and to all men freedom to follow whatever religion each one wishes, in order that whatever divinity dwells in heaven may be benevolent and favorable to us and to all who are placed under our authority." End quote. That's actually a really important distinction to make. It wasn't until Emperor Theodosius I and his Edict of Thessalonica in 380 that Christianity rose to the top of the empire and became its official religion. Now, 12 years after Constantine's Edict of Milan, he called the Council of Nicaea, where he gathered all of the now public priests and bishops. He called them all together to address the Arian controversy, which was one of the first publicly recognized schisms within the church. Now, what also came from this council was the Nicaean Creed, also called the Nicene Creed. Now, having been disparate pockets for the better part of 300 years, as you can imagine, certain pockets began doing things their own ways. Arius, for instance, argued that Jesus was not co-eternal or equal with God the Father, but was a created being, which of course directly challenged the idea of the Trinity. With a myriad of other Christologies across the empire, the Nicene Creed or Nicaean Creed laid the groundwork for creating one organized doctrine for all Christians to follow. It was crucial for combating various heresies and theological disputes that were threatening to fracture the church. Issues that seem to us today resolved and almost, goes without saying, these were hardly solved in the early church. Things like the nature of the Trinity, Jesus' infallibility, Jesus' divine origins, the relationship between God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit, Mary's role in being the conduit for our faith in her Son. These were hardly worked out, as they say. Emperor Constantine's Council of Nicaea and its Nicene Creed kickstarted the church's efforts in creating a singular doctrine that all Christians would adhere to. It also gave a blueprint for how heresies would be handled in the future, beginning with, again, Arianism. Now, specifically in the Nicene Creed, crystal clear statements were made. 1, the quote, begotten, not made, consubstantial with the Father. That quote makes it crystal clear that Arianism's belief that God and Jesus were not one and the same. That's false. Jesus was begotten, he was not made. Can't get much clearer than that. 2, the line, for us men and for our salvation, that line emphasizes the redemptive purpose of Christ's incarnation, death, and resurrection. This makes it clear that Jesus' entire purpose was to redeem mankind by his death. And 3, the quote, we believe in the Holy Spirit, that officially pulls in the third aspect of the Trinity, establishing God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit. Well, this was a key piece of that particular creed. Now, why do I go into all of this on this particular episode? Well, what I'm hoping to do is show the progression, not to proselytize, as I've said in the past. Understanding the context of these people is crucial as a reminder, whether we believe in what they believe or not. The Nicene Creed, for instance, later revised at the Council of Constantinople in 381, is today still at the center of Roman Catholicism, as well as Eastern Orthodoxy, Anglicanism, and even some Protestant denominations. It's right there at the heart, and it will play an integral role in medieval thinking as well, because, it laid out a collective understanding, and with this collective understanding, any deviation from it can more easily be recognized and dealt with. Constantine the Great is one of those figures in history who was truly a game changer, whether we agree with the game change or not. Now, as I've said about William the Conqueror, Robert Guiscard, and Pope Gregory VII so far on the show, the world was quite literally one way before Constantine the Great, and it was another way after Constantine the Great. And Saint Benedict was another one of those game changers in history. And it was this world that Saint Benedict wrote his rules for the monastic order. Just as Constantine found ways to consolidate and organize and structure the church and church doctrine, Saint Benedict, over 150 years later, would do the exact same thing for monasteries and abbeys. Like Anselm, Saint Benedict was born into a noble family in Nursia, in central Italy, sent to Rome around the year 490, for formal education. Now, he became demoralized by the lack of faith and moral decline in Rome. So, when he was in late adolescence, Benedict just disappeared. He lived as a hermit, actually, in the mountains of Subiaco, where he began to attract followers drawn in by his extreme piety and well-earned wisdom, especially in matters of Christian doctrine. He wandered like an itinerant preacher for many, many years until 529 he found himself in the Apennine Mountains of central Italy. Roughly 95 miles southeast of Rome, the eastern peaks of the Apennines pierced the sky, and it was as if that was as close to heaven and as close to God that the increasingly pious Benedict could possibly reach. So, he established a monastery there with the men who had been following him. The monastery came to be called simply Monte Cassino, and it was in this grand mountaintop monastery that Benedict wrote what he saw as a way to bring about order within the monks who devoted their lives to worshiping and praising God. Now, I've recently gone through some of these rules in previous episodes, so I won't outline them all here, but the consequences of those rules impacted Christendom almost as much as the Nicene Creed did. The rule of St. Benedict fundamentally changed the landscape, and not just figuratively. The rule of St. Benedict changed the physical landscape as well, as over the course of the next several hundred years, Europe would be pockmarked with monasteries filled to the brim with men of all ages, worshiping God, working with, and against in some cases, local nobility and royalty, physically altering the land in their immediate vicinity, and helping to navigate the medieval mind through scientific and philosophical breakthroughs, as well as political evolution. Much like God put the whole of existence into order, they believed that they too, through the rule of St. Benedict, put their lives in order, their spiritual and earthly lives. Routines and roles were the key to running a monastery, based on St. Benedict's rule. Monastic life became one of balance. Prayer, work, study, these were all put into a balance that it hadn't had quite so much before. In addition, the emphasis placed on supporting the surrounding community played a major part in Christianity becoming accessible to the masses in ways that it just hadn't always been. When the people saw these monks embodying humility, moderation, discipline, well, the people saw them as spiritual and earthly models for which one could strive to emulate, even if the vicissitudes of modern life kept one from reaching the same level as the monks had. People just need goals in life. And what's more, in my opinion, the rule of St. Benedict gave people the sense that the monks were putting their money where their mouths were. They preached of certain values, and now it was made public to the point that the people could see what those virtues looked like in practice. Guided by obedience, prayer, and a balanced daily routine, monks emulated how a community too could reach a certain level of harmony. And these rules were so efficient that its popularity spread like wildfire across the continent. In fact, even today, among Catholic circles, St. Benedict had so much of an impact on Europe's previous 1,500 years that he's regarded as the patron saint of the continent itself, with a feast day even of July 11th. Now, circling back to this young man named Anselm, wandering around France for a few years. Well, he finds himself arriving again, as we said, at Bec Abbey. Now, Bec Abbey was founded only a few decades earlier than Anselm's arrival. It was fairly the new kid on the block. In the year 1034, around the same time that young William the Bastard was leaping out of windows in the middle of the night and hiding in haystacks until the sun rose, all to escape an assassin's blade, around that same time, a Norman nobleman underwent a profound spiritual transition. His name was Herluin of Contville, and he was no doubt involved in all the earthly pursuits of the time, including warfare. But for reasons lost to history, Herluin renounced his inheritance, his wealth, and his titles, and he chose the monastic life. Being so well connected to other prominent Norman and French families, including being the cousins of the abbot of Saint-Étienne in Caen, he was actually able to secure the funding of a new abbey, an abbey he believed would become the hallmark of the duchy. Built near the village of Lebec-Helwyn, roughly 30 miles southwest, Helwyn created what would soon become what he wished for in its founding. Monks moved to Helwyn's new Bec Abbey, slowly at first, but it quickly turned into the place to be. Founded in the Benedictine tradition, daily life was strictly regimented, and the monks quickly formed a tight-knit community. Within a decade, Bec Abbey found knocking on their doors one Lanfranc, an Italian monk who had already had a burgeoning reputation as an honest, capable, and highly, highly intelligent man. Within a few years, Lanfranc was elected by the monks there as Bec's second abbot. Now we know a little about Lanfranc already. Abbot Lanfranc quickly pulled the likes of Duke William into his circle, so close to the point that Lanfranc would not only run the abbey that the future conqueror would frequent and support, but he would also be named a young William Rufus's tutor. This connection between the highest levels of nobility within the duchy soon prospered as the Duke conquered a kingdom across the Channel. The conqueror booted its Archbishop Stigand of Canterbury just a few years into his reign there, and in Stigand's place the king forcibly installed the supremely humbled Abbot Lanfranc into the role. For a number of years, Lanfranc was in England. In fact, he rarely returned to Normandy after that, let alone Bec Abbey, but he kept in close contact with all the monks there. In fact, besides both Lanfranc and Anselm, be intimately tied into English monasticism and ecclesiastic power during and well after the Norman conquest of England. From Bec would come Ralph de Sceure, who was Archbishop of Canterbury between 1114 and 1122, and Hugh of Amiens was the Bishop of Lincoln between 1186 and 1200, among many other notables from Bec. Now, one of those monks at Bec Lanfranc would be in very close contact with during his time in England was the aforementioned Anselm. Lanfranc was senior by at least 20 years, but Anselm had become a close friend and confidant with Lanfranc. Even separated by the Channel, they kept in close communication all those years. When Anselm wrote the first of his monumentally important treatises on the existence of God, called the Monologion, he wrote his friend a letter asking for honest feedback. They were very close, these two. In fact, the self-conscious Anselm wrote the following in that letter, quote, "So I turn to my one and only adviser. I send what I have written for examination, so that on the authority of your judgment, it may be either kept from sight as something unsuitable, or be corrected and offered to those who want it." End quote. Now, basically, Anselm respected Lanfranc so much that if Lanfranc thought it was trash, Anselm would accept it as such and move on with his life. Thankfully, Lanfranc gave some supportive criticisms. Anselm revised the manuscript, and we today have the first real glimpses of what would become to be called the ontological argument, an argument for the existence of God that pretty much still confounds our best and brightest thinkers today, which is saying something because the likes of Aquinas, Descartes, Hume, Russell, Plantinga, Hegel, and most famously Immanuel Kant, who swung for the fences on the ontological argument, they've all taken a crack at it. Some got pretty close to dispelling it as well, but I'm sure we'll talk about that when we get to the episodes on Anselm's theology and philosophy. Now, that connection between Lanfranc and Anselm, two towering minds in the 11th century, would be an easily overlooked but impossible to overstate connection between Normandy and England that would have untold consequences going forward. It's no wonder how Anselm was elected abbot of Bec upon the departure of Lanfranc. And, just as a note, Anselm's time as abbot of Bec was a prolific time of writing and philosophizing and building a continent-wide reputation. As abbot, in the early 1070s, he wrote a meditation on the virgin birth called On the Virgin Conception, the famous Monologion in 1076, where he laid out his ontological argument in its infancy, as I said, and he wrote a response to the criticisms of the Monologion called the Proslogion in 1078. Also in 1078, he wrote one called On the Freedom of the Will, which he argued that human free will is compatible with the idea of a sovereign, all-knowing God. During that time, he also wrote On Truth between 1080 and 1085, which explores the nature of truth and its relationship with God. Now, sometime in the 1080s, we're not sure, he wrote another one called On the Fall of the Devil. That is a reflection on the fall of the angel Lucifer and how such a perfect creature chose to rebel against God. Now, why that is. Another one, he wrote Why God Became Man, and that was written no later than 1098 when he was in Canterbury, and marks another one of his most famous works that answers the age-old question, why God took on human form. And this introduced what we now know as satisfaction theory to Western philosophy. And then finally, he's not done. Finally, in 1100, he wrote his Letter on the Procession of the Holy Spirit, in which Anselm takes on the great schism of 1054 itself, throwing in his thoughts about the filioque clause in the Nicene Creed, which was a major point of contention between Eastern Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism. We talked about the filioque clause way back during our talk about, the schism of 1054.
This episode is brought to you by Paramount Plus. Gladiator 2 is now streaming on Paramount Plus. Rated R. Years after the death of Maximus, Lucius is forced into the Colosseum after his home is conquered by tyrannical twin Roman emperors. With the future of the empire at stake, he must find strength and honor to return the glory of Rome to its people. Gladiator 2, now streaming on ParamountPlus.com.
And this brings us to Anselm's first time crossing the Channel, having been summoned by the English king, William Rufus. Now, Rufus was sick, as we know from the last episode, and he was having a medieval existential crisis. Certainly one of those points in one's life where you feel like the end is nigh, so it's time to kind of clean out your closet and get one's affairs in order, even those of the spiritual type. Now, Rufus was dying, so far as he knew, and he'd realized that he'd done the English church pretty dirty, most notably leaving the See of Canterbury, its largest see, without an archbishop since the death of Lanfranc, and reaping the revenues collected by England's wealthiest and most influential monastery as well. Not a good look, at least spiritually. And in Rufus's mind, it might have gone something like, well, God, if I could just survive this fever, I promise things will be different. Right. So on Sunday, March 6th, 1093, in walks Abbot Anselm of Bec to the bedside of King William II, there in the city of Gloucester. But it's important to know that Anselm had already arrived on the island a few months earlier, in September 1092. Anselm had visited the king. He had toured some of the monasteries around southern England and the Midlands, and he even gone as far as Chester as an honored guest of Earl Hugh. As Frank Barlow states in his biography of William Rufus, quote, no episode in the reign is more carefully described than Anselm's election to Canterbury. It was, as seen by Edmer, Anselm's biographer, the opening scene in a tragedy, for he noticed only the resulting injustices done to his hero and the Mother Church of Britain and their great suffering. End quote. He goes further and says that the appointment of Anselm showcased an obvious blunder, a rare failing of William Rufus. He was known for his straightforward words, plain speak, as Barlow puts it, but also his courage. On the battlefield, Rufus could be found always in the front, leading the charge, but on his deathbed, staring oblivion right in the face, he had become half of what he was. As Barlow puts it, it was, quote-unquote, a rare case of self-deception induced by an even rarer failure in courage, his fear of death. And it seems that Anselm, too, demonstrated a rare mistake. He allowed himself to be duped by the sick king's warmth when he arrived. Anselm had been a monk at Bec for 33 years at that point, and he'd been abbot there for about 20 of those years. Coupled with his close friendship with his mentor, Lanfranc, he was acutely attuned to England, both under William I and William II. Now, frankly, Anselm should have known better. In his late 50s, Anselm already had the reputation of being one of the intellectual giants of the day, as we saw earlier. And it wouldn't take much qualification by the 17th and 18th centuries to declare him, in Barlow's words, quote unquote, the greatest speculative theologian in the West between St. Augustine of Hippo and St. Thomas Aquinas. He was highly articulate in multiple languages, had close connections from England to Rome and all points in between, and was widely regarded as one of the towering intellectuals of his day. That said, he was soft-spoken, patient, and humble. For those of you who would have read Pillars of the Earth by Ken Follett, a novel about the building of a grand cathedral in the fictional English village of Kingsbridge during the reign of Stephen in the 12th century, well, Anselm reminds me of the main character, Prior Philip, a man who makes tough and sometimes unpopular decisions, yet still a man who is widely respected and seen as a man of God, just trying to do the right things in all things. All that said, Anselm was, in all honesty, swept up in the tsunami of Rufus's personality and his will. Sick and presumably dying, Rufus was determined to fix a few wrongs. Consequences be damned. If Anselm was who he handpicked to be the next Archbishop of Canterbury, then his will shall be done. That was Rufus's way. What neither of them knew at the time was that King William II wouldn't, in fact, die in 1092 or 1093, and that once recovered, Rufus's newfound piety would soon wear off. But Anselm was a man of God, and he was a priest within the Catholic hierarchy. He was also a supporter and ally of the deceased Pope Gregory VII's reforms, now being continued and brought forth into the new century by Pope Urban II, and therefore applied his situation in England with the overall goals of Gregorian reform, which centered on the fact that the nobility and royalty had absolutely no right to depose or install any clergy at any level of the church. William Rufus was pushing to install Abbot Anselm of Bec as the new Archbishop of Canterbury. Staying true to Gregorian reform, how could Anselm accept such a position gifted to him by a king? Well, what made matters even more complicated was that when Pope Gregory VII died back in 1085, William I, the Conqueror, he never officially declared his support for Gregory's successor. And when the Conqueror died in 1087, Rufus never officially declared either. As far as Rome knew, England had fallen off the edge of the earth regarding support for the papacy. So not only would Anselm's acceptance of a position as archbishop be in question in Rome, but it would be seen as a break from the Gregorian reforms sweeping Europe at the time. Through the Christmas festivities, Anselm ducked and weaved his way around conversations with the king and his advisors and other clergy in the kingdom, as well as those correspondences back in Bec. It seemed to me as if Anselm tried to wear his opponent out to the point that the king would just move on from him. But this didn't happen. Anselm was even asked by Hugh de Branche, Earl of Chester, when he was up in Chester, who was a well-known scoundrel, by the way. He was asked by him to consecrate the building of a new monastery at St. Werburg, and he was able to slip in and out of that event without having to make any clear statements as to where he stood on the archbishopric. And this brings us to March. By March 1093, March 6th to be exact, William Rufus's condition had worsened to the point that Anselm was brought to Rufus's bedside in Gloucester. Rufus's bishops were eager to take advantage of the king's rare admission of guilt and wrongdoing, and with the towering figure of Anselm of Bec on the island, they were able to coax the king into considering a little harder this time, considering Anselm for archbishop. England's prime see was still vacant, and that was just a travesty. The bishops, as I said, were eager, but it was more like they were foaming at the mouth. Barlow writes, quote, "When Rufus declared that the abbot of Bec was the most worthy of that office, they applauded enthusiastically and hurried Anselm to the bedside to be invested by William. The abbot seems to have been taken by surprise. In my opinion, just a show." Okay, back to Barlow's quote. In all his letters on the subject, he stressed the suddenness of the event, and he resisted stubbornly. But he stood completely alone. The Beck monks who were with him were fatalistic. The bishops were determined not to lose this heaven-sent opportunity of getting a primate, and were bewildered by and then indignant at Anselm's refusal. And the king had convinced himself that this was the only way in which he could evade death and damnation. End quote. The bishops even went as far to tell Anselm that this was clearly the will of God, and that refusing it would be a sin, a very grave one actually, that God willed in that moment that the monks and lay people of Canterbury required him to ease their long period of suffering. Nice twist of words there. They argued more importantly that God had given Anselm the opportunity to fix the irregularities of the English church. How in the world could he refuse that? But Anselm could also be stubborn, and he still refused. Numerous times, actually, even in front, in the presence of the king. Now, according to Edmer, the king on his deathbed even pleaded, quote, "Oh, Anselm, what are you doing? Why are you delivering me to crucifixion and eternal punishment? Remember, I beg of you, the true friendship which my father and mother had for you, and which you always had for them. And in the name of that friendship, I entreat you not to allow me, their son, to perish, both in body and in soul. I know for sure that I will perish if I die while still in possession of the archbishopric. So help me, Lord Father, and take it from me." End quote. Pretty dramatic, if you ask me, but as with most of these medieval records, I believe there is still a hint of truth in it. Rufus most likely laid it out in similar terms, and may even have had a desperation to it. I mean, the guy was dying for all he knew. Now, the air in the king's chamber must have been thick with the stench of sweat. Just imagining it. William laying in his bed, his face pallid under the torchlight, his body shivering beneath embroidered covers. The fever had stripped him of his usual arrogance, leaving his voice hoarse and his limbs weak and heavy. Disease tends to have that effect on even the lively of us. Yet the king's will had not faded. He still ruled with an iron conviction, even though his body was failing him at the time. Anselm stood by the bedside, his shoulders rigid in spite of his exhausted, hunched posture. The old monk's face a mask of calm protest. He'd come to offer prayers, not to be ensnared in the wily young king's schemes. And I imagine him, Anselm, in one last desperate attempt at an honorable refusal, saying something like, "My lord, I'm not fit for such an honor." And raising his chin ever so slightly in a manner that conveyed firm resistance, he added, "I am but an old man. I am a simple monk devoted to my faith. I'm not suited to govern your great church." The king maybe coughed, thick and wet, yet his eyes still burned, still commanded. The courtiers assembled had grown silent, watching, knowing that even in sickness this king was a formidable man. To deny him was a dangerous game to play, especially in his current state. William said evenly, with a voice of iron, "You will take it. Canterbury needs an archbishop. I need an archbishop. Priest, my soul needs this. Will you leave a man on the doorstep of death with such a chain around his neck? Is that what your holy books teach?" Anselm's head, I imagine, lowered, his gaze falling to his feet. Letting out a long, slow breath without meeting the king's eyes, he responded, "No, my lord, it does not." William eases into his bed once again, a look of triumph, a shadow on his clammy face. "So," he said between coughs, "it is settled then." Proverbs 15:27. No. The king's face was confused. "Excuse me, father," he said. Proverbs 26:6. Anselm muttered to himself. The king looked around at the other men in the room, who seemed to be just as bewildered as he. 1 Kings 21, Anselm whispered. Matthew 4, Deuteronomy 23. Anselm stopped as if in deep thought. Deuteronomy 23, is it 17 or 18? He asked himself. "Speak up, priest," The king said sternly. "What are you saying?" Anselm looked in the king's eyes and smiled a soft smile of triumph. "Proverbs 15:27, he said softly. "Whoever is greedy for unjust gain troubles his own household, but he who hates bribes will live." The king had a look of confusion, a man trying to make sense of something he couldn't quite figure out. "Proverbs 21:6, my lord," Anselm continued, reads, "The getting of treasures by a lying tongue is a fleeting vapor and a snare of death." 1 Kings 21:1. Well, I can't quite remember, but it offers the story of Naboth's vineyard. William was getting irritated at this point and demanded to know what the hell the man was talking about. Anselm allowed the profanity and continued. See, King Ahab accepted Naboth's vineyard after the king's wife Jezebel unjustly orchestrated Naboth's death. This was a gift that was not hers to give, you see, and Ahab's acceptance of it led to divine judgment. A heavy pause filled the room. The priests were stiff, realizing what Anselm was doing. This was a foolish, dangerous game he was playing with a man like William Rufus. And William sat himself back up in his bed and said through gritted teeth, "Priest, I offer you the most honorable title in the entire kingdom, short of king. The See of Canterbury is yours. I give it freely to you, and you will accept it. And when you accept it, we can forget about whatever game you're playing at here. You will be the leading churchman in this kingdom, and your name will be spoken in Rome itself. The English church is yours to guide, and the monies collected around Canterbury will be yours to do with as you please. Now, I give you one last opportunity. Accept my offer freely." Anselm responded after a moment in a low voice. Matthew 4:8-10. "Accept the offer, priest," William said in a harsh tone. Again, the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their glory. "Seize his arms," William roared. Anselm just continued, "And he said to him, 'All these I will give you.'" The old priest's voice caught as the men grabbed his arms. He restarted the line with a shiver in his voice. "And he said to him, 'All these I will give you if you fall down and worship me.' Then Jesus said to him, 'Begone, Satan, for it is written, you shall worship.'" Anselm's voice cried out in pain in that moment. His hands were clenched into fists because he knew the part of the acceptance of the position was to receive a staff, a pastoral staff, held by the Archbishop of Canterbury. He who holds the staff holds the see. His old dry knuckles were bone white from the strength needed to keep his hands closed, but 3 men were prying them open quite forcefully. One of the men gained purchase of one of his fingertips, and prying it open, the man pulled too far, and a snap was heard in the room. Anselm looked down and saw his finger at an odd angle, and for just a few seconds the room had just stopped. Even the king was frozen in surprise momentarily. Through his sobs, Anselm looked the king straight in the eye, and he finished his passage. Jesus said to him, "Begone, Satan, for it is written, you shall worship the Lord your God, and him only shall you serve." Well, the men around him began again, and Anselm kept up the fight in agony, while William was able to force him to close one hand around the staff. All backed away from Anselm, and the room fell quiet. Okay, so I imagine it kind of went something like that. Of course, the dialogue wasn't recorded, but we know there was a tense back and forth between Anselm and King William, and we know that William ordered those in the room to pry open Anselm's clenched fists. And the bit about his broken finger is a later embellishment of the story, but Anselm's biographer, Edmer, makes efforts to detail that it was a violent scene indeed, and Frank Barlow writes, quote, "In the end, the courtiers lost patience, pushed and pulled him to the bedside, gave the king a pastoral staff, and attempted to prise open Anselm's clenched right hand. But they only managed to pull back his forefinger, using such force that Anselm, he cried out with pain." End quote. So, I mean, it's not a bad stretch to say they broke his finger, so. Now, Edmer adds that once the staff was in Anselm's grasp, quote, All present cried out, "He has received it! He has received it!" End quote. With Barlow adding that they all began singing Te Deum Laudamus, or, translated, "To God we praise." Now from there, William laid back on his bed, probably exhausted from the effort and stress of the moment, while the bishops who had helped force Anselm into the role of Archbishop of Canterbury, well, they ushered Anselm out of the chamber in a hurry and into a nearby church. And by ushered, I mean to say that they had picked him up and carried the old man because Anselm was protesting the entire way. Holding him in place in the church, the priests then did the necessary rituals, said the certain lines, and then they dragged the new archbishop back to William's chamber. Yeah, it was like a whole thing for sure. Now, according to Barlow, once Anselm was in William's presence again, the archbishop said, I imagine rather sternly, quote, "I tell you, Lord King, that you will not die of this sickness, and therefore I want you to know that you can change what has been done, for I have not accepted and do not accept that it is a valid act." End quote. Again, those were Barlow's words. Now, Anselm was still insisting that he was not archbishop, and he let his feelings be known about that the whole time, even though he must have known he was without a single iota of power there. He turned, then, to the bishops in the room, the men who had been nothing more than the king's henchmen over the last hour or so, and he spoke a parable. In Barlow's words, quote, "These bishops were proposing to yoke an old and feeble sheep with an unbroken bull to pull the plow, which, as a result, would be dragged uncontrollably through the thorns and briars, to the great detriment of the sheep, its wool, its milk, and its lambs. Now the plow, he explained, was the church, which was guided and hauled by the two most distinguished oxen, the king and the Archbishop of Canterbury. The one ruled by earthly justice and power, the other by divine learning and instruction. One of the oxen, that is to say Lanfranc, was now dead, but the other, still young, had the ferocity of an untamable bull, and they proposed to yoke him, an old sheep, with that. He then spoke of all the harm which would be caused by the inequality, disasters even worse than those then afflicting the church." End quote. It's a pretty interesting parallel to draw, England being a plow led by two bulls, one bull being the king, the other being the Archbishop of Canterbury. One bull was dead, while the remaining bull was a brash, unpredictable young man. And the new bull, the second bull, was just an old man having to be yoked to that brash, unpredictable young one. Well, if you can believe it, that's not even the end of the story of how the future Saint Anselm of Canterbury was invested. News relative to the 11th century traveled fast, and William and his cronies needed to get ahead of this scandal, because make no mistake, this was a scandal of the highest degree. In the age of Gregorian reforms and the investiture controversy, well, what happens when an investiture occurs, but the person being invested refuses the investment? It didn't help William's cause that both the current Pope, Urban II, and Anselm were both staunch Gregorian reformers, as mentioned earlier. Now again, this was bad. This was a bad look for an English church that was already seen as an outsider to mainstream church doctrine. They have been for a long time. A letter-writing campaign commenced immediately with a certain Gundulf of Rochester writing to Bec Abbey, begging and pleading with them to, quote-unquote, release their abbot. But Bec didn't so much like what they'd heard happen to their beloved abbot. Quite simply, they didn't want to lose Anselm, but if Anselm wanted to go, then they would approve it. But as we know, Anselm didn't want to go. Therefore, Anselm was asking Bec to refuse it from their end as well. King William even went so far as to add tax levies and wealth accumulation to Anselm's new title that included the city of Canterbury as well, which Anselm would no doubt send a little Bec's way. And what of the question of an election? Every new leader, especially according to Gregorian reforms against investiture, stated that a new archbishop, a bishop, an abbot, and even a prior was to be voted on by those in that particular monastery. Well, Anselm received no such vote from Canterbury when he had the pastoral staff thrust into his injured hand, but William's men argued that the actions of the assembled bishops was vote enough to legitimize Anselm's rise to archbishop. Therefore, that whole argument's a non-starter. In fact, it wasn't a non-starter at all. It was actually an important issue, though, that needed to be addressed. But they somehow were able to gloss right over that. In the end, the pressure was just too much, and Anselm fell into the position and accepted his fate, albeit reluctantly. Anselm was a powerhouse of a mind during the 11th century. It would take centuries for, arguably, his largest contribution to Christian theology and philosophy to receive a good intellectual dubbing from an 18th century German philosopher named Immanuel Kant. By his investiture of Canterbury, Anselm was known around Christendom as one of a handful of preeminent thinkers of the day. This, in part, was why William Rufus wanted him so badly. England was ripe for a rewritten history, and a man like Anselm at the helm of England's church would do wonders for England's overall image. Due to some legal reasons, Anselm didn't make it to Canterbury, and this was March, by the way. He didn't make it to Canterbury until late September, and it wasn't until December 4th, 1093, that Anselm was officially brought through the ceremonies befitting a new archbishop. After 4.5 long years, Canterbury finally had an archbishop to replace the deceased Lanfranc. And if there was ever someone to fill old Lanfranc's gargantuan shoes, it was most certainly Anselm of Bec. But things would not cool down between Archbishop Anselm and King William II. In fact, this would inevitably devolve into a match made in hell. Thanks for listening. Until next time.